players get frustrated because they don't feel that they feel like their coach has certain standards and they're working really hard. There's not that transparency. And that's one of the big things we have to have as really effective coaches is very clear transparency over what are the standards. What specifically? Clarity, clarity, clarity. And so clarity produces consistency. Right? Consistency produces results, right? If I'm a player and I don't know coach's standards or I don't know what kind of support I'm going to get to reach those standards, I may not buy in. So if you let them know how you're going to support them, right? I support them by kicking their butt. I support you by challenging you. And then I'm really, really direct at communicating the why, right? And I think that's really what this generation is looking for, is this generation gets written off time and time again. And I really don't agree with it. I think they're a very thoughtful generation. I think they are wise beyond their years. You are listening to the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast, transforming athletes into leaders on and off the court with host Coach Furtado. Coaches, are you ready to take your passion for coaching and turn it into a full-time career? I know the challenges firsthand, but the Make Money Coaching Sports program helped me take BTG basketball full-time. If you're tired of juggling coaching part-time and want to fully focus on doing what you love, this business accelerator will give you the tools and support to make it happen. Hit the link in the show notes below to learn more and start living your dream. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast. I'm your host, Coach Furtado, and I'm flying solo on this episode, and I'm going to talk about in this episode the proven formula for what it takes to be a great teacher, a great coach, and a great leader of young people, and it's called the mentor mindset. Now, in this episode, I will be sharing you a chapter from David Yeager's book, 10 to 25, a groundbreaking approach to leading the next generation and making your own life easier. Now, who is David Yeager? For most of you who are listening to this episode, you are people who are interested in your own personal self-development. Now, have you heard of Carol Dweck, author of Mindset? I'm sure you have. Now, David is Carol's highly recommend that you put it on your reading list. I'm reading it really slow so I can really understand the concepts. All right, so that's the context. Now let's get to the point of how you can be the most effective and outstanding coach. And the mentor mindset requires these two things. Very simple. You have to give athletes or young people a high level of support, and you have to give them high standards. Now, let's talk about the two really kind of personalities that we see often are the protector. So the protector is what I fall into sometimes when I'm not holding athletes to a high standard. So what the protector does is the protector gives athletes or young people a high level of support. They know they're on their team, right? They give them all the praise, all the good stuff. They have low standards, and sometimes they protect their kids too much from challenge, from failure, which actually does a disservice to those kids in the long run. Now, on the other side, you have the enforcer, and the enforcer is kind of the typical teacher, coach, traditional, old school is what I would say. And they have super high standards, but they don't give their athletes enough support to reach those standards. And so then there becomes a disconnect, right? And a lot of times, yes, that coach may get a lot of wins, right? But that coach doesn't generate buy-in. And if this goes on a losing streak, those players can buy out instead of buy in, if that makes sense. So if we want to have a great mentor mindset, we want to have high standards, and we want to have high support for our athletes to reach those standards. And I'm going to share a little bit on how I fail sometimes, and I have failed in the past as a protector. So let's say we are in a basketball practice. I have players, let's say they're goofing off. Now, I would protect them from running because, I make whatever excuse for them. When in reality, right, I need to discipline them for their behavior. And so when I first got into coaching and there are kind of some ebb and flow, sometimes I can be quote unquote too soft. All right. And so how do we want to discipline? How do great coaches discipline? They discipline the input. So the way that we do it is, now if they have that behavior issue, what should we do? We should, number one, ask, are these our standards, right? Ask them a question, right? The kids know. They know whether they're doing the right and the wrong. And then giving them the support that, like, hey, you know what, Joe, I know you can reach these standards. Like, I know you can reach them, you can meet them. So that way we kind of turn the onus onto them, and we tell them, we give them the support, right? You can reach these standards. You can lock in and focus in this activity, in this drill, in this game, like you're supposed to. Now, on the flip side, right, let's say the enforcer. Typically what you'll see is, you don't reach my standards of this drill, of this game, you run, right? And I'm not going to tell you why. I'm not going to give you support. You need to figure it out. Now, there's a time and place for it, right? We can't coddle and hold our kids' hands to do everything. Otherwise, when they get into the real world, they're not going to be prepared, right? But we still have to have those conversations. So, in order to enact the mentor mindset, we have to be able to have high level of support and a high level of standards. And so the best teachers, and he breaks it down in this book, which I highly recommend, the best teachers, they have really high standards for their kids, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's a 15-year-old boy and they, like the most BS saying, and one of the most BS sayings is, boys will be boys. No, that's unacceptable, right? You are normalizing that behavior that is unacceptable. Now, how do we do that? We have high standards. Hey, Joe, right? You're goofing off. That's not our standard. I know you can reach X standard. And not every kid is going to reach that, and that's okay, right? At the end of the day, we can't force kids to meet a certain standard. And so then, now what do we do with that kid, right? How do we support a kid who is struggling, right? Now, let's say I have this one athlete, and I will, keep them unnamed. They didn't get as much playtime as they wanted this year. They are undersized as an athlete. However, with that being said, they play hard. They're really committed, and they just love the game. They're such high competitors that sometimes they can frustrate their teammates. And so what I've been doing is it hasn't been a beautiful and perfect journey, but continuing to have conversations with these athletes and give them support. Like, you can play great defense. You can be a great teammate, right? And have those little things. And it takes time, right? But you put the ball in their court. Hey, how do you think you can get more playtime? Hey, how do you think you can earn your teammates' trust? And don't just ask them during practice when things get emotional, because that's not when we're going to get our best responses. These conversations are ever going and ongoing. I'm not sure ever going is a word. If you get to know me, I make up a lot of words. Anyways, carrying on. These conversations, it's not just a one-time thing. I think that's what sometimes for us as coaches, we have, I had that role conversation with the player at the beginning of the year. Well, now we're 2 months in, they've improved, someone else is injured, and they're still at XYZ. And then, a lot of times what happens is kids get frustrated, right? Players get frustrated because they don't feel that they feel like their coach has certain standards and they're working really hard. There's not that transparency. And that's one of the big things we have to have as really effective coaches is very clear transparency over what are the standards. What specifically? Clarity, clarity, clarity. And so clarity produces consistency, right? Consistency produces results, right? If I'm a player and I don't know coach's standards, or I don't know what kind of support I'm going to get to reach those standards, I may not buy in. So if you let them know how you're going to support them, right? I support them by kicking their butt. I support you by challenging you. And then I'm really, really direct at communicating the why, right? And I think that's really what this generation is looking for, is this generation gets written off time and time again. And I really don't agree with it. I think they're a very thoughtful generation. I think they are wise beyond their years. Do I think there's some of them are hypochondriacs and they have too much information? Most certainly. But is that their fault? Really? Is the world that they're living in, is it their fault? Maybe to a certain extent, and we can have a debate here and there. We need to produce clarity. There's so much noise for these kids. We need to create clarity of our standards and clarity of how we're going to support our athletes. So, my question to you all that I want you to think about or journal on is, are you more of a protector, right, who gives athletes high support but has sometimes lowers your standards? That's where I am, right? So I try and shift into the middle. Or are you an enforcer? You have high standards, but sometimes you don't always give them the support to reach those high standards. Identify it, depending on our nature and nurture, right? We kind of are going to fall into one or the other categories. It takes work and intention to get into the middle. And are we always going to be perfect? No. Sometimes I may go into the high standard side. I may go into the protector side. It's just something to be really mindful of. This is what it takes to be a great coach. And you're doing the right thing. If you're listening to this podcast, number one, you clearly care about kids. And number two, you clearly care about your own learning and development. And that's what's most important. So make sure you subscribe to this podcast, because I have great conversations with people who are a lot smarter than me, who have helped me accelerate my learning, growth, and development, because I've been able to ask people with more experience, with more research. So just be a learner, be a lifelong learner. And I hope this podcast can be a resource for you to keep learning. Coach Furtado out. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share it with a friend, coach, or parent you feel like would get value from this episode. It's our responsibility to impact as many parents and coaches who are the ones that are impacting our athletes. That's how we create a ripple effect. So thank you for being a part of our community, and we look forward to serving you all next week.